Hi, my name is Briana Toole, and I am an assistant professor of philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. I research standpoint epistemology, which basically looks at how what we know depends on facts about our social identity in some cases. My big picture question is, how does some knowledge get normalized? And more importantly, whose knowledge gets normalized? How does some knowledge get normalized? And by this, I mean, how does knowledge get systematized? And whose intelligence, whose knowledge gets systematized? And what does that mean for people whose bodies of knowledge deviate from the supposed norm? So I want to start by grounding, my big picture lecture by thinking and talking about the current social and political moment. So let's think just a little bit about George Floyd. Some people see the video of George Floyd being killed, and they see a justifiable use of police force. And then some people see a clear case of police violence. And this sort of discrepancy in what we see and how we interpret what we see exists in more innocuous cases as well. So think, for instance, about perceptual illusions. My personal favorite is the blue-black / white gold dress. Some people see that dress as blue and black, others see it as white and gold. Or consider for a moment the famous Wittgensteinian Gestalt. Some people in that case see a duck, others see a rabbit, some see both. So my question that I want to think about and unpack today is this: what's going on in these cases? Why can't we understand each other? And why is communication across lines of difference so hard? And more importantly, and interestingly to me as an epistemologist, is why is it that some people's way of seeing or knowing or engaging with the world is taken as the right way? And what happens when we know something that conflicts with that dominant way of seeing or understanding the world? In my research, I suggest that certain bodies of knowledge get treated as standard or normal, and contributions that conflict with this are rendered deviant by these modes or models of understanding the world. And this ultimately leads to a sort of oppression that is neither social, nor material, nor political, but is distinctly epistemic. So Christy Dotson defines epistemic oppression as the unwarranted or unjustified exclusion of certain individuals from the practices of knowledge production. So let's stop here for a moment and think about what exactly it means when we say knowledge production. Knowledge is produced in a number of both formal and informal ways. So formally, knowledge is produced in academic, legal, medical institutions through research and scholarship. But it's also informally produced and disseminated through our relationships with each other in communities, in families, through storytelling and in myth-making, and so on. And straightforwardly, we should be able to see some pretty obvious ways in which certain bodies are excluded from both these formal and informal mechanisms for knowledge production. So consider, for instance, that Blacks and women weren't even permitted in institutions of higher learning where research would have been produced until after the turn of the 20th century. And then even following their inclusion, their bodies of knowledge were dismissed for either failing to conform to dominant modes of understanding, or because the knowledge they produced was in direct tension with prevailing understandings of the world. So just some quick examples to illustrate. Karen Jones, a philosopher who works primarily on testimony, describes a case in which a United States judge initially denied refugee status to a woman who fled her native Togo in order to escape female mutilation on the grounds that her testimony lacked rationality. Now, we might abhor that kind of ruling, but from the perspective of the judge, living in a country where female mutilation seems literally inconceivable, from that perspective, this woman's testimony might have seemed literally inconceivable, impossible, beyond rationality. Or consider how this lack of inclusion of certain bodies in certain spaces affects our medical practices. So Nancy Tuana has examined the adverse impact of healthcare initiatives that fail to center women's needs and instead treat the male body as the medical diagnostic norm. So if you look, and I really recommend you check this out because it's fascinating and devastating, Women are more likely to die than men because of heart disease, heart attacks, and heart failure, because they're more likely than men to be misdiagnosed when they go to the hospital presenting with symptoms. And that's because heart disease manifests and presents differently in women than it does in men. Or consider, for example, that just last year, 2019, textbooks finally introduced an anatomically correct model of the female body. Prior to that, if you take a quick look at science textbooks, you'll notice that the body is always represented as the male body. And this leads to certain failures to consider that certain ailments present very differently in women than they do in men for a number of reasons. We carry our fat in different locations. We're likely to engage in different activities and behaviors. And so failing to consider the ways in which the male and female body present differently leads to women getting less adequate health care compared to men. This is true along racial dimensions as well. So what is going on here, I suggest, is that our existing systems make sense of some bodies of knowledge, but not others. And when we fail to make space for alternative or non-dominant bodies of knowledge, we're causing certain harm. So basically, epistemic exclusions, to my mind, lie at the heart of most forms of social, political, and material oppression. It's precisely because knowledge is developed and disseminated from a limited perspective that certain harms, like I've just described, happen in the first place. And so here's where we start to get into an answer to that big picture question that I posed at the beginning. I think we just can't understand this issue without first understanding what it is or how it is that some people know, for instance, that heart disease presents differently in women than in men, when others don't or can't know this. And to understand that, we need to think first about how some kinds of knowledge are developed from an embodied perspective. So I want to start here with an innocuous example that I use when I'm teaching my college students, because this idea that knowledge is produced from an embodied perspective can be quite difficult to reconcile with how we think knowledge ought to be produced. So if we had met in Scotland as planned, I might have asked you to recollect how you got off the plane and made it to St. Andrews. But since we're not going to be able to do that, given coronavirus, try to imagine, for instance, if you were in New York City or Chicago, how you might get from point A to point B. Now, I lived in New York City last year, and I lived in Bed-Stuy. It was about a 45-minute train ride from Bed-Stuy, where I lived, to my office at Baruch Cooney. And I would have to change stations 3 times. Now, here's what I noticed after 6 months of living in New York. I finally realized that there were no elevators in the subway stations that I used. And the moment that I realized that, I looked around and thought, I have no idea how someone with physical disabilities is supposed to get around in the city. I have no idea how someone who's elderly is supposed to get around in the city. The subway is the heart of New York. It's what connects us. It's what allows us to move about. And to not be able to access the subway system means that you are restricted in certain ways into certain locations. But because I am an able-bodied woman, I never had to think about what it must be like for a disabled person to get around in New York City. And so here's where the issue arises. As an able-bodied woman, I don't think about the world from the point of view of someone who's physically incapacitated or disabled, because that's just not my problem. Those issues are not salient to me, given that my body is an able-bodied. And so these issues won't be salient to you if you don't need to approach the world from the perspective of a disabled person. The issue for me arises here, when a non-disabled person dismisses the knowledge or problems that a disabled person brings up. So if a disabled person says, hey, New York City is really not designed for people with disabilities. I can't access certain libraries. I can't access certain subway lines. I can't then say, well, I don't think that's a problem because I've never seen it. Because the very issue is that I'm not going to see it given my embodied perspective, and they are. So really, to get back to our big picture question, I want to better understand why this is happening and why we dismiss knowledge developed from certain points of view. And I believe that standpoint epistemology, which is my field of study, can help us better understand this issue. So just to give a bit of context, standpoint epistemology is the view that whether some person, S, can know some proposition P may depend on facts about that person's social identity. Now, this research project is Marxist in origins. So Marx developed this analysis from the standpoint of the proletariat. He said, look, if you are oppressed by the capitalist class system, you're going to notice certain things that the bourgeoisie won't notice simply because they're not in a position to see it. And so his account was devoted entirely to our relationship to labor. Now, Marxist feminist accounts went on to expand their analysis to include gendered labor. So one of the things that Marx missed in virtue of being in a male body is that women do a whole extra set of labor when they come home from the factories. It's what we now call the double shift. Women work in factories, and then they come home and they do another round of labor that allows for the production and reproduction of laborers themselves. They wash laundry, they cook, they clean dishes, they care for elderly, and then they literally produce more workers and that they reproduce and make children. But that's not labor that's paid, and so it fails to be recognized as labor at all in many contexts. Now, my account broadens this analysis beyond our relationship to labor to account for social experiences more broadly. So just to give a funny little anecdote, I don't know how many of you watched the TV show Insatiable, but there was one really excellent episode where Alyssa Milano is in the bathroom and she's talking to her husband who's on the other side of the door, and she's in the process of removing her tampon. And so she's rooting around for her tampon and she can't find it, and she's yelling through the door, I've been doing this for 30 years. How is it possible that after all this time I can't find my tampon? And then she has an epiphany and she rushes outside and she says, that's my big idea. I'm going to attach a ring and a tassel to the end of a tampon string so that women can find their tampons more easily to remove them. And her husband says, I've never heard of this problem. What are you talking about? And therein lies our problem. Why would a biological male ever have to consider the problem that women or females or people who menstruate have with locating and removing their tampon? And so he dismisses this knowledge that she has from her embodied female perspective. Okay, so zooming out, the question I wanted to answer is, how is this happening and how do we address it? Conceptual resources here play a really, really big role in explaining why some of us know some facts about the world that others seem to overlook or dismiss. Now, conceptual resources are tools that we use to attend to aspects of our environment. So when I say conceptual resources, I mean the concepts, the language, and their associated criteria that we use for making sense of the world. It turns out if you don't have some concept, you're not likely to see the thing that concept picks out. So here's an illustration, and this one comes from some interesting work in neuroscience that looks at the relationship between color concepts and perceptual experience. So these researchers went out and did some interviews with the Himba tribe. They're located in Namibia. And it turns out the Himba lack the concept for the color blue. And the reason that they lack this concept is because they live in a desert-rich environment in which there are very few blue objects. It also turns out that blue is not a color that occurs in nature very often. So beyond the sky, if you live in a desert environment, there might not be any blue objects around you. It turns out if you show the Himba 11 green squares and 1 blue square, it will take them several minutes before they can tell you which square is the odd man out. And that's because they don't have the concept for blue. But interestingly enough, because they live in an environment where there are lots of different shades of green, they have tons of different concepts to delineate between different shades of green. So if you show them 11 green tiles and 1 green tile that's a slightly different shade of green, they can immediately locate the square that's different. Now you present that to someone who's grown up in a Western context where we don't have as many concepts to pick out different shades of green. So someone like myself, it takes me minutes to find the different green square. And so the situation's inverse because they have lots of green concepts, but we don't have the same number of concepts. They're much better at identifying different shades of green than we are. Conversely, because we have the concept blue and they lack it, we're much, much better at identifying the blue square than they ever could be. And this isn't just true of the Heba. It turns out in Russia, they also have many, many different concepts to pick out varying shades of red. And consequently, they're much better at identifying differences in shades of red than we are in the United States. Now, to return to this idea of conceptual resources, here are some examples to give you a sense of what I mean. Conceptual resources might include something like marriage. Marriage historically would have been defined as a union between a woman and a man. But our concepts can change as we change. So we now realize that marriage is a societal construct. And so we no longer define it as a union between a man and a woman, but as a union between two consenting adults. Or consider, for instance, our concept of woman or women. 20 years ago, we might have defined women as adult biological females. But once again, we now know that woman is a social construct. It doesn't pick out anything essential to a person's body. And so our concept of woman has expanded so as to include people who identify as women, even if they're not biologically female. But here's where the problem arises. Many of our conceptual resources are shaped by the dominant perspective, the dominant experience, the dominant point of view. And this leaves a lacuna where experiences of marginalized individuals are concerned. So consider, for instance, the concept of sexual harassment. That was not introduced into our legal terminology until the 1970s after a group of women participated in a process known as consciousness raising. Carmita Wood, a Black administrative assistant in the Cornell Department of Nuclear Physics, experienced sexual harassment from her boss. She left her employment, but when she was going to file for unemployment, she couldn't explain why she had left her job because there was no conceptual resource to explain what had been happening to her. Consider alternatively the concept of marital rape, the idea that a person can be raped by someone who is their spouse. This did not enter the legal lexicon until 1993. So prior to 1993, any woman who might have been raped by her husband had no way of explaining that because rape is defined as the taking of something that's not yours. But the presumption of marriage was that women are viewed as property, and so men are entitled to their wives' bodies. So before the introduction of the concept of marital rape, wives who had been raped by their husbands had no way of explaining what they'd experienced. Or consider the more contemporary example of microaggressions. So microaggressions are these sort of subtle indignities that pick away at some aspect of your identity. So for instance, if you're Latina and someone asks you, where are you really from? The implication being that because you're not white, you can't really be an American. Or if you're a person who menstruates and you're in a particularly grumpy mood and someone says, oh God, you must be on your period, huh? The suggestion being that your anger is not rational because you're a woman. If you look this up, you'll see that microaggressions still are not accepted as a thing that picks out a real phenomenon. So people say that if you look up Jonathan Haidt, or I believe it's Greg Lukianoff, they argue that microaggressions are a tool of snowflakes to complain about something when there's nothing happening. But for those of us who experience microaggressions, we know that they're very real and they do pick out a real phenomenon. And so there's this tension between how the marginalized are trying to describe the world and then communicating that to the dominant who still don't see the world in that way. So what happens is the dominant tend to discount marginalized experiences because they don't have the conceptual resources to understand what it is we're trying to communicate. This has the unfortunate consequence that it creates a feedback loop so that the marginalized can't contribute their knowledge. Now, think about this. This seems like a really academic interest and academic concern, but the truth is that this is a worry that applies more broadly. It trickles down into every single system in which we participate. So consider the process of schooling and myth building and how schools maintain and reify certain myths so that they naturalize submission. So we might learn in school via our relationships with others or how we see teachers treated that perhaps we think Blacks are violent, or Blacks are more likely to be criminal, or Blacks are unreliable. What this does is create a system in which we view Black people as unreliable testifiers, and so we don't trust their testimony. As such, when a Black person tells us, hey, I've experienced an instance of police brutality, we might take the perspective of the dominant and suggest something like, oh, well, the Black person probably deserved it. If they had just complied, they wouldn't have gotten shot. And so the worry is because the dominant aren't taking seriously what the marginalized are trying to communicate, they develop this sort of insensitivity or literal blindness to things that are happening right in front of their own face. So, how do we get out of this pretty dire situation? How do we make it such that we're able to communicate with people who have radically different life experiences than we do? I think there are a few ways out. One thing to do is to critically interrogate our systems of education and how we tell our history. So for instance, Howard Zinn has this excellent reframing of the history of the United States that he tells from the perspective of the people. That's one way in which to challenge our dominant methods of understanding. Instead of viewing Columbus as someone who discovered America, seeing him as someone who committed mass genocide and rape. We also have to cultivate a willingness to listen to others whose testimony is at odds with our worldview. Now, this is hard because it produces something called schema clash, where we're being given information that just radically conflicts with how we see the world. So, for instance, if you think that women are essentially kind, nurturing caregivers, then when you hear about a woman who's a military combatant, you might think, whoa, that's not possible. Women can't be in the military. To be a warrior, to be in the military, you have to be strong and aggressive. That's not what women are like. And so you end up with this schema clash where you have two ideas that are literally butting heads. And what we need to make happen is one schema to open up to receive the other. This can be really disorienting though. So let's return to the idea of the Wittgensteinian Gestalt that I mentioned earlier. A Gestalt shift happens when you're looking at this illusion and you go from seeing the duck to finally seeing the rabbit. It's fun, but it's disorienting to have that experience because you realize, oh my God, there was this thing here this whole time and I never even saw it. But this is true of harder cases as well. You might see a man flirting with a woman, and you might not realize that she's being sexually harassed by her boss or coworker if you don't have the concept of sexual harassment. You might see a white woman touching a Black woman's hair and not realize that that Black woman is suffering a microaggression if you don't have that concept. And so a big part of what we have to do is recognize that Black bodies, women, minorities, they're producing knowledge that we might not be able to see, but that does not mean that we can't dismiss it. Because the thing that's causing us to not see it is the fact that we didn't take seriously the testimony to begin with. And then finally, I suggest that we have to adopt a stance of humility. We have to, each of us, even those of us who are marginalized, be aware of the fact that there's so much that we don't know and that our perspective is limited. So that's the real takeaway from this big picture question that I want to ask. We have to be better about having tough conversations, about listening to others with other points of view, because we tend to think that knowledge is objective, that if I know something, that anyone, regardless of their social position, regardless of their upbringing, can know it. But if I'm right in my suggestion that much knowledge is embodied and is developed from the particular point of view of the bodies we inhabit, that means that we have to acknowledge that our perspective is very limited, and the only way we can get more information is by talking to people and accepting as true the testimony that they give us from their radically different embodied perspective.